Good morning and welcome. Can I ask people come a little forward? And I'm most grateful that you woke up early and came. I usually teach in the afternoon, so I found it quite an experience to get up early and beat the traffic. So thank you for coming. We have two very important people here, people whose careers I have followed for years. Both of them are Palestinian Christians. Both of them speak eloquently and have been writing eloquently about the situation in Palestine. The first speaker is going to be Dr. Naim Ateek, who is canon in the Episcopal Diocese of Jerusalem. He had a Palestinian congregation in Jerusalem. He is the co-founder and the retired director of Sabil, which is the ecumenical, specialized in ecumenical theological liberation theology. And he lives now in Texas. Yes, and we're delighted to have you here. And Jonathan, who I think moved from Maryland. I thought he was my neighbor, but he moved to Philadelphia, somewhere in Pennsylvania. He grew up in Bethlehem and Jerusalem. Mr. Kuttab is a graduate of the Messiah College, Pennsylvania, and University of Virginia Law School. He is a member of the Bar Association in Palestine, Israel, and New York. He's active in human rights. He co-founded Al-Haq, the first Palestinian human rights organization, the Mandela Institute for Palestinian Prisoners, the Palestine Center for the Study of Nonviolence in Jerusalem, and other Palestinian and international groups. He's chairman of the board of Bethlehem Bible College and of Holy Land Trust, and he's very involved in peace and reconciliation activities. So we'll start with Canon Ateek. We are delighted to have you. Yes. It's up to you. You can go there or here.
This is fine.
Okay.
Well, first of all, I'm very thankful for the invitation. So it's good to be with you. Thank you for inviting me. It's nice to be back here in Georgetown. I was here many, many years ago, again at your invitation. So it's good to be here. I want to talk about, or my topic was suggested that I'll say a few words about the Palestinian Christian community and talk about American foreign policy. And I will depend on Jonathan. He's probably more knowledgeable about American foreign policy, but I'd like to mention some things that have to do with the work that I'm doing. Let me, I just noticed I need to turn this off before we begin.
You too also. Feel free to join him in this worthy effort.
Okay, so let me begin with about the Christian community. Obviously, as many of you know, it's a big topic. There's so much to say about the Christian community. But just to really put you in the picture of the Christian community, some of you might know quite a bit about it. There are others that might know very little. So I'm beginning with some really simple introduction, that the church was born in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost. And it started really with around 120 people, including the Jesus' disciples, apostles, and Mary, his mother, and other friends, when the Holy Spirit came on them on the day of Pentecost. And it's from there that the church branched out. In Palestine, in those days, outside Jerusalem into the area of what is called today the West Bank, Nablus, Samaria in those days. And from there to different areas around all of Palestine and then outside Palestine. We know from historians that by the 4th century, Palestine had become predominantly a Christian country. And so the church was taking roots in the community there. And in the first few centuries, the Christian communities were really centered around 5 patriarchates within that area. And most of the patriarchates were in what we would call the Middle East. So, because that's where the Christian community was in the different communities, in the different churches there. So Antioch was one of those patriarchates, and around Antioch, in the whole Syria region, Christians were spread in that area. Alexandria was one of the major also patriarchates, and Rome, those three, and Jerusalem. And then later on, New Rome, Constantinople. And these 5 major patriarchates where the patriarchs were living, the Christian community was gathered, was living, was witnessing, was spreading the gospel in those areas. And it's very interesting that in the Jerusalem diocese, in the Jerusalem Patriarchate, it's important to at least mention that the original church of the land was the Orthodox Church. Today, we need to explain this, because in those days, it was only one church. Nowadays, the original church of the land is composed of both the Orthodox Church and the Melkites, which is the Greek Catholics. Yeah. They were the original church of the land. About 300 years ago, there was the church itself divided, and so now they have the Melkites as part of the Catholic also churches. But they are part of the original church of the land with the Orthodox Church. And it's very important that by the beginning of the 4th century, Constantine, the emperor, became Christian, and the persecution of the Christians stopped, and the church continued to spread, but started meeting new challenges. And I want to mention 3 challenges, because these 3 challenges continue to be with us. And I think they still constitute, in many ways, the agenda of the work that we are concerned about and we are involved in. So for the first 300 years, although the church had taken root in various countries and among different ethnic groups and cultures, it was still perceived as one church. As we read in the New Testament, one Lord, one faith, one baptism. It was perceived as one church, in spite of the fact that it was spreading in different areas of the Middle East, where different cultures existed. And we used to think that the difficulties that arose in those days were mainly theological, but now we know they were partly theological but partly political within the and partly cultural. So some of the Christians, by then, talking about 4th century now, part of the Christians were living under the Roman Empire. Other Christians were living under the Persian Empire. Some people were speaking Greek. Others were speaking Coptic. Others were speaking Aramaic. People did not understand each other. You know, the language, different languages, different dialects. Sometimes we're not aware of these things. We thought everybody spoke Greek, you know. But when the difficulty started, because people did not even understand each other, the situation was difficult. The theological controversies that began in those days among the Christian communities zapped the church's energy. And the central theological issues, as many of you know, had to do with the place of Jesus Christ vis-a-vis God. You know, and the church wanted to maintain the oneness of God, the monotheistic faith, but they wanted to see how they can express it. And we know, unfortunately, that by the end of the 5th century, most of the Eastern Christians, the Middle East Christians today, most of the Eastern Christians found themselves outside the body of the main Christian church. And that was part of the tragedy that took place. The Assyrian Church of Iraq, the Coptic Church of Egypt, the Syrian Orthodox Church were divided, you know, where they left the main body of the church. So that, again, one can say so much, and if we have time in the discussion, I can go into greater details. But that was the first internal division of the church, of the Christian community in the Middle East, and it really affected the church. The second major change was the coming of Islam in the 7th century. And the early period of Islamic rule, the relationship between Christians and Muslims was good, was generally good. And Christians formed the majority of the population. As time went on, the situation changed and the dominant Muslim minority became the majority. And obviously they were the rulers, the governors there. And non-Arab Muslims rulers, when non-Arab Muslim rulers took over, it became more difficult for the Christian, and there were persecutions, there were difficulties, there were great challenges that faced the community, the Christian community, and we started losing numbers in a more accelerated pace, you know, in those days. And obviously, in the Middle East, people look very negatively against the Crusades. And when the Crusaders came from the West, again, it was very difficult for the local Christian community, because when the Crusaders came, the schism between Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity had taken place between Constantinople and Rome, and that became so that when the Crusaders came to Palestine, they saw the Christian community as also a foreign community in one sense, because of the schism that had already taken place in 1054, you know. And so the coming of Islam was a big challenge and continues to be for the Christian community, and I will say more about it in a minute. And the third big challenge that affected also the Christian community was the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. So, with the establishment of the State of Israel, obviously, It's not like divisions within the body of the Christians and the Muslims. The country itself was divided. And that's very significant because it really affected the life of the community there. And it is in the early 1990s, Sabil came into being. So I want to take a minute and tell you about Sabil. This new movement within the Christian community started as a result of my first book, which I wrote about Palestinian liberation theology, Justice and Only Justice, a Palestinian theology of liberation. And in this book, I outlined that we as a Christian community, we have a role to play. We have a responsibility, And from this foundation of a Palestinian liberation theology perspective, Sabil came into being. Sabil is an ecumenical center that was created in Jerusalem, and it started ministering on 3 different levels. Ecumenically, started to minister to the Christian community. Because of the divisions of the Christians, Sabil was bringing the Christians closer together in an ecumenical way. And that was very significant. I still remember Jonathan actually was one of the founders also of Sabil. So we were together when Sabil came into being as an ecumenical ministry, transcending denominationalism, at the same time appreciating the denominational affiliation. So we were trying to strengthen the Christian community. Now the Christian community in the 20th century, towards the end of the 20th century, was very small. We have lost numbers. And again, that's a big topic that we don't have time to go into, but if there are questions, we can talk about. The Christian community that was the majority in Palestine by the 4th century. Now it was, when Israel came into being, maybe around 15%, and today it is less than 2% in the whole of the country, Palestine, Israel. So it was important for Sabil to bring the Christian community closer together. So in our programs, whether with women, whether with young people, whether with the clergy, and these programs are continuing today in the community there. And the main objective is to bring the Christians closer together, so that they begin to see their identity vis-a-vis Christ rather than vis-a-vis a denomination. So trying to rise above denominationalism, although we're thankful for the rich heritage of the different wonderful liturgical churches that we have in Palestine and in Israel. So this is one of the foci of the work of Sabil, the ecumenical ministry. The second one is the interfaith. Because of the challenge of Islam, and because the Christian community, although we've lived with Muslims for many centuries, and generally speaking, the relationship was okay, with the exception whenever we had, some of those governors, Islamic governors that were not really Arab, and some of them were very cruel and very vicious. But generally speaking, in Palestine, the relationship was pretty good with people towards each other. In spite of that, we are alienated to a large extent from each other. And so Sabil took on itself the responsibility of trying to really bring the Muslims and the Christians together. And so we have the interfaith ministry. And few years after we started, we also partnered with another organization called Al-Liqa in Bethlehem. And both of us started working with the Muslim community. And it's been a great blessing to do that. We published one book in Arabic. Most of the writers, the authors in the book, were Muslims themselves. And actually, the book was suggested by a Muslim sheikh from Nablus. He came to me, I still remember, and he said, people take a wrong impression about Islam. They think that we are a violent people. Let's write a book on nonviolence. And it was his suggestion. And so we worked on that, and we wrote the book, and I will give you the name in Arabic, Al-Muqawama Al-Silmiya fil Islam wal-Masihiyya, which is nonviolent resistance, in Islam and in Christianity. And when I left the country a few months ago, we were already launching the book in the different universities in Palestine. And I think it was also launched in the northern part of Israel, in the Galilee part. And it was a wonderful thing. We would have the iftars that sometimes we do it for our Muslim friends, and sometimes the Muslim friends do it and invite us. So this interfaith ministry is trying really to break down any prejudices within our community, and there is so much more to be done. The third challenge that I mentioned is the coming of the Zionist or Islam, and there Sabil has been working in trying to educate people on the origin of the conflict in Palestine, and that's been going on for the last 27 years since Sabil came into being. And here we still are trying also to educate friends of Sabil are trying to educate Americans on this. And because most people I have found now living in the United States, that most people still in this country are so much pro-Israel because of the way they have been conditioned and because of the way they have been educated in these communities. Okay, and so I want to now mention the last part of what I would like to introduce, having to do with the American foreign policy and the situation back home. The Christian community, in spite of the fact today that it is very small in number, but it is still very active in the community. And we have impacted, and our impact is really greater than our numbers. Like the schools that the Christian community has in different places, whether we are looking at inside Israel or in occupied Palestine. Occupied Palestine for us would be the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. We have a number of organizations, not only schools, we have clinics, we have hospitals. And we have guest houses. We have many ways in which the Christian community is very involved in the life of the community. And we don't differentiate between a Christian and a Muslim in the services that we offer to all these people. At the same time, when I talk about foreign policy, American foreign policy, I cannot really talk about American foreign policy vis-a-vis the Christian community. It has to do with the Palestinian people, or with Palestine, or with Israel. So we're not really looking at we cannot really focus only on the Christians, although I'm trying to really, whenever I can, I will bring in obviously the Christian community. Now, from our perspective as Christians, the United States has not really been supportive of the Palestinians. I mean, the Palestinians have been there, both Christians and Muslims, but the American policy has been very much pro-Israel, and it's not. We cannot talk about being biased in this way or that way. The difficulty is trying really to see how one can change American foreign policy, and we have not really been able to affect it that much. Israel has never treated the Christian community in a special way. You know, a year ago, Israel came up with a new law wanting to separate the Christians from the Muslims, Palestinians. And we rose up against that. And I know that Sabil had written a very important piece of writing against what Israel is trying really to do. It's the old saying, divide and rule. Because of the fact that we are one community, and on the issue of Palestine, we're very much united. We are Palestinians. I recall I was a boy in 1948 when the Zionists came and occupied my town, and the town had Christians and Muslims living in it, and they gave us a few days and they drove us out, and we lost everything. They did not treat the Christians in any special way. We were Palestinians, and they wanted the land without the people. And so we were driven out, and we came to Nazareth, and I was brought up in Nazareth. So the land confiscation does not differentiate between Muslim and Christian. Our land is confiscated, whether a person is a Christian. Our land has been confiscated. My family's land has been confiscated. So the discrimination that's going on is against Christians and Muslims. We feel it on a daily basis. Unfortunately, America, the United States, has not really been able to help us resolve the conflict. From a Palestinian perspective, whether Christian or Muslim, we believe that the resolution of the conflict must be based on United Nations resolutions and on international law. This is what we believe. Israel does not want to abide by international law. That's it. And the United States has been on the side of Israel most of the time. It has not really been willing to honor, to respect international law. I think President Obama tried, as all of us know, in his first year of his presidency, and I think he was hit hard, and he stopped. More recently, John Kerry became very much involved, and he really tried very hard to do something. And we were hoping, as Palestinian Christians and Palestinian Muslims, that when America would discover that Israel doesn't really want peace, want the whole country still, and does not want the people, and all the different laws, which I'm sure Jonathan will talk about. But in spite of all of this, we thought that when America will see this, they will take a stand for justice. But in spite of the fact that we believe that John Kerry knew the situation, he was aware of what was going on, totally aware, it's the Americans who pulled back. And they let Israel get out of hand in the way it's been doing, working against the Palestinians. So nowadays, the situation is terrible back home. And some of you who have visited there recently know this. And I think Israel today is committing murder, and no one is able to stop Israel. And the settlers are out of control, and they're trying now they're assaulting the Haram area on a continual basis. So these are the things that are happening today, and America is not able really to come or to champion justice. Our people are beginning to look to Europe, France. I don't know what's going to happen in a few days when the General Assembly of the United Nations will take place. I think they're trying to do something about it because many people, especially in Europe, are becoming aware more and more about the injustices that are committed by Israel. So the situation is very dire. And I really believe that something needs to be done about it. We would like to see America involved on the right path for justice. America has never been able to be neutral or objective about this because of internal issues here in the United States, because of the lobby, because of the Congress. The situation has not really been very good for justice. And that's why we continue to hope, and we continue to work, and we continue to resist. And Sabil has been committed to nonviolent resistance. We are not against the state of Israel. We would like the state of Israel to continue to be, and to live in peace. But we believe that Israel needs to do justice, and without justice, there will never be peace or security for Israel or for the Palestinians. So this is really where we are coming from, and this is what we are trying really to help people understand the situation and work together for a just peace so that Palestinian Muslims, Palestinian Christians, Jews can live together in peace and security. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Naim. Before I begin my remarks, I want to say how thrilled I am to be here at Georgetown. It's a very personal thing for me to be in an academic setting that truly represents ideas, thoughts, discussion. I suppose, even though by profession I'm a lawyer, I'm basically a frustrated professor, academic. There is something so valuable about academic space where any idea, any thought, any discussion is allowed. And where people get together in a civil manner and discuss things that may not very well be discussed in society at large, but where merits of an idea and the thought is valued of its own. I am saddened that recently those who have power and money and influence have targeted academic institutions. Something called campus Maccabees with tens of millions of dollars are trying to stifle discussion in US universities across the board. Just this past week, I have heard of at least 3 incidents where events discussing the Palestinian rights, discussing BDS, have been elbowed out and pushed out of US campuses through the force of power and money. And those who have tried to wield their influence to make America less democratic by buying their way into Congress and into power are now moving on to US campuses. It's interesting that it has to be the Palestinian issue that is at the center of it, but ultimately it's an issue of academic freedom and freedom of expression, and the losers, if that battle is lost, will be the American people themselves. I hope that will not come about. I hope that regardless of where one stands on either side of this issue, that at least we will preserve the space for the discussion to continue. And now to my topic. As a lawyer, obviously, I look to the law to point out what is and how it is being actually implemented. This is particularly interesting because during particularly the second half of the last century, we have seen a blossoming of international law as a system. Largely as a result of the 2 world wars, people became convinced that you can't just have an international community governed by force and might and power. There needs to be some rules. There needs to be a system of laws that govern the behavior of countries. And the system was beginning to be built by fits and starts. The United States was at the front of that effort until towards the end of the last century, when it started to be a force against the increase of international law. But the idea is very good. You really need a set of rules to govern the behavior of countries. You really need international law, not only if you are weak. It's said usually law is created by the powerful, but in the end, it defends the weak. But you need it because you need order. You cannot have chaos. You cannot have force alone rule. Palestinians felt very comfortable with this construct. And they said, yes, international law. Yes, the United Nations. Yes, human rights. Yes, some system that governs, decides the rights of individuals rather than force. Because, as you know, violence only proves who has more power, not who is right. And Palestinian Christians have been very much involved at the forefront of this struggle for international law and for human rights. I'd like to think that that is not only because we are a small minority and weak and can benefit from rules that talk about equality and law and human rights, but that it also is part of our faith. Christ, despite the sorry history of Christian power throughout the centuries, Christ was very clear that my kingdom is not of this world, that you should render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's. The idea of separation of church and state, the idea that you cannot have the state impose religion, and you cannot have the state favor one religion over another, is at its very root a Christian idea. My kingdom is not of this world, said Jesus. So that resonated very much with Christians, particularly in the Middle East and also in Palestine. That really, since the rise of Arab nationalism, a very secular movement where Christians were really at the forefront, from George Antonius to George Habash, the idea that there should be equality in a body politic. الدين لله والوطن للجميع. Religion belongs to God, but the homeland belongs to all of us. That somehow this idea, by the way, on which the United States itself was founded a couple of centuries ago, really resonates and continues to resonate with Palestinian and Arab Christians today as an ideal that is worth pursuing. It's very strange that even in this country, at this late moment, people are still asking questions of whether Obama is a Muslim or not. And the answer, of course, is not, well, obviously he's not. But what difference does it make? It shouldn't make a difference. The idea that as many as 30% of Republican Americans today think that Islam should be made illegal in this country. Crazy. How can you even think about a religious requirement for political office in the United States? So it is no surprise that Palestinian Christians were at the forefront of Arab nationalism and Palestinian nationalism in the sense of insisting on separation of church and state, of equality before the law, of rejecting any religious basis for civil political rights. But how does that work out in practice? And how does that work out when we have powerful forces today, from Zionism, calling for a Jewish state, to Daesh, ISIS, calling for an Islamic state? How do Christians deal in such a world where ideas that one would have thought were totally anachronistic are in fact beginning to take root and are in fact wielding effective political power and using violence massively to impose their ideas on the peoples of the Middle East, including Christians. Including Christians. So now, all of a sudden, the fight or the battle for human rights, for international law, for equality before the law is no longer theoretical and theological and academic, but becomes an issue of practical daily survival. Survival in a very physical, immediate sense. And the place where you go to see those things is the law. Yes, the testimonies that one takes, the evidence that one has, the video clips on YouTube, the rape and execution of people by Daesh, of Christians and Yazidis and anybody else on a religious basis, as well as the violations of the rights of non-Jews in Palestine, are an important part to bring this to our attention. But the reality is that there are laws on the books that lead necessarily to those activities. There are ideologies promulgated that necessarily lead to discrimination, to racism, to denial of rights. And this is, again, where I find it's important to concentrate our efforts. You see, the thing about law, even bad law, is that law, by its very nature, is applicable across the board. Law, by its very nature, applies to one and all. And if a law is discriminatory, if a law is racist, if a system of law and a legal system grants rights to one particular portion of the population and denies it to other portions of the population on the basis of religion or race and creed, then it has a name. It's called apartheid. And it is, on its face, illegal, evil, improper, and worthy of a fight against it. South Africa had laws on the books granting and stating what are the rights of blacks and coloreds and whites, applied across the board to all blacks, to all whites, to all coloreds. And people of goodwill on the outside who could look at this situation could conclude, without being necessarily anti-South African, without necessarily being biased, without necessarily being called to task for their positions, could say, this is wrong. This is illegal. This is improper. This is evil. This is a system that is unjust and that ought to be challenged and changed. You didn't have to be pro-black. You didn't have to be anti-white to say that these laws are wrong. Now, what happened is that when the State of Israel was created, the trauma and the evil of the Holocaust and the history of anti-Semitism in the West, not in the Arab world, was such that Israel was given a pass. That the Zionist movement was not called to task when it established a system, a political and a legal system, that granted rights to Jews, which was denying to the indigenous population, whether they were Muslim or Christian. Somehow there was an acceptance, a legitimization that a Jewish state be created and that laws that favor Jews over non-Jews were okay, were fine. And perhaps at that time, in the trauma of the moment, maybe that made sense. Or maybe, more likely, Christians and Muslim Arabs were basically absent from the mental picture. That people did not really see them. That somehow they were not part of the calculus. That it was a land without a people for a people without a land, and certainly the suffering of the Jews was so clear and concrete and legitimate and evident that the issue of the indigenous population was not really taken into account. Now, that can no longer be said to be the case. Now, the situation of Israeli Jews and of Jews generally worldwide is not that of the underdog. Now it is the Palestinians, Christians and Muslims, who are at the receiving end and who are calling for justice, and who are calling for human rights, and who are calling for equality, and who are once again waving that flag about the illegitimacy of laws and systems that deny them equal rights. Now, I can go into specific details and point out to specific laws that discriminate against non-Jews in the state of Israel. I can talk about the basic denial of rights of Palestinians in the occupied territories, whose situation after more than 40 years is no longer a temporary situation of occupation, but rather a permanent state of subjugation. I can talk about Christians and Muslims inside the state of Israel, about 20% of the population, who today feel totally marginalized. We're in a very fractured society, always built on coalitions. Their political weight is zero because no Zionist party would agree to form a government with them or to give them prominent positions in any coalition in Israel. What I want to say instead is that the role of Christians in the Holy Land continues to be a vital weather vane, and a very positive one, because there are those in this country as well who would very much like to turn the struggle into a religious war between Judaism and Islam, between the Jewish state and the Muslim world, which is why what's happening now in Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem is so incendiary, so dangerous, and so pernicious. Because the fight is not a religious fight and should not be allowed to become a religious fight. That is why the battle is not between Judaism or Judeo-Christian world and Islam and the Islamic State. It is a political fight a human fight. And nobody wins. No advantage can be taken by turning it into a religious war. And the presence of Christians, however small, 1 or 2% of the population, is the constant fly in the ointment. That's the negative image. The positive one is we are the salt of the earth. We are the ones, the determiners, and the determined thing in terms of what's good for the Jewish people. Whether it's land ownership, whether it's entry into the area, whether it's systems of governance, whether it's education, economics, you name it. It's all based on what's good for Jews, in this case, Jewish settlers, as well as the Jewish state. And then when we talk about the state of Israel itself, there's a wide variety of laws, and recently they have been much more blatant. There's been about 27 laws that were proposed in the last 3 or 4 years that specifically talk about the Jewishness of the state and that impose additional burdens on non-Jewish people in the state. And there's also the practice, which means that there are laws that are linked to your military service, which is primarily for Jews rather than Christians and Muslims. There are, just recently, they announced in Jerusalem, they were renaming 30 streets in East Jerusalem with Hebrew names. A small, insignificant thing that is just meant to irk the local population, to tell them this is a Jewish state, you don't belong here. You are not an equal citizen. Azmi Bishara, a member of Knesset, basically had to flee the country and live in self-imposed exile because he came up with a very radical idea, namely that Israel should be the country of all its citizens rather than the country of the Jewish people. So 20% of the people who are citizens in Israel are denied that right. They're denied family reunification. If they want to marry, if an Israeli Arab wants to marry a Palestinian Arab from the West Bank or Gaza, they can't bring their spouse to live with them. Entry into the country. Arab Americans constantly are facing the problem even to visit. At the airport, at the bridges, they can be turned back because they are of Arab origin rather than of Jewish origin. The land ownership, the zoning, the planning is all based on public land being Jewish land and serving Jewish purposes rather than serving Israeli purposes for the entire population. The list is very long and can go on and on. The problem is not the specific laws, I think, although the laws are illustrative. The problem is with the basic premises that Israel is and was intended to be a Jewish state for Jews and for the Jewish people rather than a state for Jews and Arabs who happen to be indigenous or its citizens.
Thank you. Questions?
Thank you very much for both presentations. Could either or both of you speak a bit about the state of sectarianism within the Palestinian community in historic Palestine? And in particular, I'm curious about how you view the situation and the positions of Hamas and Islamic Jihad, Daesh, and so forth, and whether you see a trend, either positive or negative, in Christian-Muslim relations within the Palestinian community. Thank you.
I'll just begin. Maybe Jonathan will add something on that. It has not really been easy for us. I'm talking from the perspective of our interfaith work, at Sabil. It has not really been possible for us to really talk to some of the Hamas people. First of all, we cannot get to Gaza, where most of the Hamas people, or the core of the Hamas people are. But I have been able to talk to some people who were sympathetic with Hamas, but not very radical in their perspective. And nowadays, I think Hamas has lost quite a bit of credibility because of the fact that they have not really been willing to honor the agreement to unify the West Bank and Gaza together. And Hamas is, I think, bears the blunt of that, because they're the ones who have not really been willing to really reconcile and to work. So that's been part of the difficulty that we have. But on the religious level, although some of our sheikhs might articulate or express certain sympathies, but I think most of that have been lost, because most of the Palestinian people today have been pushing for the unification, for unifying the two segments of the Palestinian land in that sense, and I think Hamas has not really been willing to really do that. But you might want to add.
Well, Hamas basically arose as a response to the failures, the corruption, and the inefficiency of Fatah and the Palestinian national movement. At its beginning, people were very clear that Hamas could not command more than 25% of the population, even as a political movement. However, as Palestinian nationalism, the secular movement, weakens and shows itself incapable of addressing the needs of the Palestinian people, people turn to religion. And Hamas plays that card of religion, even though a friend of mine who was in prison would always tell me, when it comes to prayer time, there are more Fatah people praying than there are Hamas people in prison. But Hamas plays that card of religion, and as people are more and more disenchanted with secular nationalism, religious fanaticism increases. And I always thought that Palestinians were, if not totally immune, at least less likely to be attracted by Islamic fundamentalism than were other people. I still think that's the case, although, again, that continues to erode. I am very worried about Hamas and Islamic fundamentalism, but I'm not as worried as my Muslim friends are, because they are going to be the target before I am the target of the more radical, more fundamental, more Wahhabi, more ISIS kind. Here in this country, of course, Hamas is considered an illegal organization. It is demonized the way the PLO was before relations opened up. I think that before any kind of meaningful progress can be made between Israelis and Palestinians, Hamas has to come out of the cold, has to become part of the political process. I think that they would love to be, and maybe that's part of what one can do to promote peace if one is interested in that kind of thing, to try and work against the delegitimization and demonization of Hamas in this country. Having said that, I still agree with Reverend Naim that Hamas has made many, many mistakes and has not helped its own cause and has lost a lot of credibility. The joke is that if elections are held today in Gaza, Hamas would lose. If they are held in the West Bank, Fatah would lose. Palestinians are disgruntled with both political movements.
Here and for your presentations. We've watched over the last couple of weeks if Israel has imposed more laws penalizing stone throwing. I'm wondering what the room is for nonviolent demonstration in the West Bank on the one hand or in Israel on the other, and whether there are any movements, whether Christian, Muslim, or secular, to continue to promote nonviolent resistance.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for asking the question. I feel personally, because of what's really happening back home, and the fact that we're not really moving, and the world is unable really to resolve this issue, and the United Nations is incapable without the powers. I've been thinking more and more recently that what needs to happen is another intifada, but a non-violent intifada, totally non-violent. And it has to start back home. I'm even thinking that maybe the older people should not really or cannot do it. Maybe we need to look to the students, to the younger folks. And it needs to start with the younger folks back home. And there was a time, Jonathan, I'm sure would remember, all of us, organizations, NGOs, we were conducting nonviolent workshops, trying to really to train people on nonviolence. I don't hear that we're doing it anymore or as much. But I really feel what needs to happen today is we need to start this. I wish the President Abbas would start it himself. And he will march with all the leadership of the PLO, that they will march. Because the world gotten used to the fact that this situation in Israel-Palestine has been going on forever. Arabs and Jews have been fighting since time immemorial. That's the way people sometimes say. And Israel is very comfortable in controlling the Palestinians. Every Friday, the young people, after the Friday prayers, they go out and they interact with they clash with the police, with the Israeli police. But the police is able to control it. It has not really spread to a point that it is a national thing that's happening. What can be national in this? And that's why I feel personally it can only be nationalized if we have a non-violent movement that in which we are martyred rather than killing other people. That is, we need to accept suffering instead of inflicting the suffering on other people. If that intifada can start, I think there is hope. Because I really do not see where hope is coming from if it were not for a non-violent struggle in that sense. This is what I'm convinced more and more about, that this is what needs to happen today, because the situation there has become very desperate, And I think, and we've given up on the Americans. We've given up on on the people who call for violence, obviously. And I think it can only happen probably through the nonviolent resistance. I don't know how, Jonathan.
I'm much more hopeful. I think that there is room for nonviolence. I think nonviolence is the only effective method. I think Palestinians have practiced it intermittently with varying results. I think Palestinians continue to practice it. I agree with you. We have to be much more systematic about it and much more consistent. And we have to realize also that nonviolence will still meet with violence from the other side. Any form of resistance is going to be challenged. Look at the BDS movement. Totally and explicitly and specifically nonviolent in this country. It's being treated as a mortal threat to Israel. Netanyahu says it's the existential threat. It's no longer the Iranian bomb, by the way. It's BDS that is the existential threat to the state of Israel. And it's an explicitly non-violent movement. And there are non-violent people who are working on non-violence in the Middle East, in Palestine. There are even people within Hamas who are talking about non-violent popular resistance as being an important method for resisting the occupation. And it has to be. It has to be. Because violence only breeds more violence. That's what Christ taught us. You know, those who live by the sword die by the sword. We must find a better way than just trying to out-violence the other side. I'd hate to think of the amount of firepower that you need to out-violence the Israeli army. I'd hate for it for both sides. That is definitely not the way to go. Nonviolence is the way to go.
Thanks so much for making the trip across. Naim, it saddens me that you've lost faith in us, but I understand that. I think you were part of the Kairos document for Palestine. You know that there is a Kairos USA document as well, and we have a conference in 2 weeks that I'll have the privilege to be a part of. With that, what we're hoping to come out of that is actions that we can take to address Congress with that. And when I talk with Palestinians that I know and Jews, the general consensus that I get from them is the two-state solution is dead. And they think really the only solution is a binational. But I've never heard binational solution in the US. So when we take our opinions to Congress and address those members, what would be your opinion? Would you propose for a solution of a binational solution or a two-state solution?
Thank you. Well, again, thanks very much. I mean, this is an ongoing issue that are talked about all the time. At Sabil, we've always said that we believe the one-state solution is the ideal solution. But for the sake of Israel, we were promoting the two-state solution. That is because of the fears of the Israelis that they would be overwhelmed with so many Palestinians and so on. We said, we'll talk about the two-state solution. And also because the United Nations was talking about the two-state solution, although we think the United Nations was wrong to begin with. But that's what they proposed at the time in 1947. You know. Now, the problem today is that it is Israel that has killed the two-state solution. It's not we who killed it. You know, Israel is creating a one state. That's what Israel is doing. But Israel is creating not a one state that is democratic. It is creating one state where Israel is dominating the whole country in total dominance, and it's an apartheid state. And this is what I think Jonathan is talking about. And so we are willing to live with one state. We are willing to live with the two states. We're not willing to live with an apartheid state, with a racist state. And racism in Israel today is spiraling, you know. It is unbelievable. If you go and you see the racist attitudes of the, in fact, I have with me a document that now many of the very violent people among the settlers, I don't know whether you've seen this article, that most of the leadership of that are Americans. They're American Jews. And they're the ones who are practicing the racism against the Palestinians with, it's very ugly. I mean, burning churches, seeing the Christian community as an idol worshippers. This is what these racist people are saying. And Israel is not doing much about them. In fact, instead of taking them to court, you know, Israel is giving them only administrative detention. Can you believe it? So I think our people have been very flexible over the years. Maybe the older generation wanted to go back to Palestine, you know, one Palestine and so on. But I think we've become very flexible. That's why I say we're willing to accept the one state, but if it is democratic for all the people, by national state, that's fine. I think our people would accept it. But our leadership still is sticking to the two-state solution because it is the UN resolution in that sense. And although we've rejected it in the beginning, but now we are accepting it if it can become a reality. But I tell you, the problem now, who is able to convince Israel? Because Israel has killed the two-state solution, and what we are up against today, and we have to resist, is the apartheid state which Israel is doing. And I hope that whatever Kairos is going to be doing, you know, try to really lift up this very important thing, you know, against the apartheid state of Israel.
Yeah. I think a whole lot of time and effort and energy and emotion has been wasted on trying to find what is the ultimate solution, two-state, one state, and arguing the merits, the possibility, the feasibility of one or the other. I personally have decided several years ago not to even engage in that discussion, not to even engage in that debate. Ultimately, I think people of goodwill who care about peace and reconciliation and all the good things are really powerless to address that issue. What we can address are specific issues. We can talk about human rights. We can talk about equality. We can talk about racism and discrimination. We can talk about violence and nonviolence. We can talk about sending less rather than more weapons there to either party. We can talk about justice. We can talk about equality. We can talk about blatant racism. And I think that's where our efforts need to go rather than a theoretical discussion of one state versus two states. Although, in an academic setting, you can always do that.
Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you very much. Both of you have referred to your travels in the United States and the bias, let's call it, against the Palestinians and the acceptance of the Israeli narrative. Can you tell us over the years what changes in attitudes have Americans begun to make in view of, number one, the emphasis on international law, nonviolent resistance on the part of the Palestinians, and also the events in the Middle East, in the Holy Land, and particularly the assaults on Gaza, especially the one in 2014. So to what extent are Palestinians not as absent from the American imagination as they have been? Rashid Khalidi, you probably know, has talked about a turning point, a tipping point, based on the most recent war on Gaza. So welcome your comments on this.
One thing, we have to be brief because we have to empty the room for another.
Okay. Yes, I think there has been a major change. I can even point to specific constituencies that have changed. I think we have seen changes in the Jewish community, for example, with Jewish Voices for Peace and others who really feel totally uncomfortable with Netanyahu and his policies. But one particular community which I've been tracking very closely are the evangelical Christians. Among evangelical Christians, there has been a sea change in attitudes, particularly among the younger people. The older theologies and eschatologies and predestination movements have really lost a lot of ground, and younger people, especially among the evangelicals, can see the importance of justice, can see the need to be open to Palestinian suffering as well as to Jewish suffering, can see the need to work for a better solution. They usually talk in terms of a two-state solution in that context, rather than just Israel being God's special chosen people who need to be supported, right or wrong, as a test of getting God's blessing. I think those type of theologies that were promoted by televangelists have really lost a lot of steam, and evangelical Christians today are much more open to a new approach that is a little more even-handed and a little more just. Also, the fact that the current government in Israel and Netanyahu especially and his envoys in this country have really sucked up to the Republican right wing in a very crass way. I think has done harm to their cause. More and more Americans are beginning to see the Palestinian suffering. The war in Gaza, I think, has been pivotal because despite the narrative that's been given, and it's interesting, the narrative emphasizes Hamas throwing these rockets over without a warhead and counts how many rockets have been thrown. They never tell you how many rockets or bombs were dropped in the other direction. And it's not 1 to 1, and it's not 1 to 10, and it's not 1 to 100. I think it's closer to 1 to 1,500. But if you describe a fight while mentioning only what one side, the punches that one side threw, I mean, ultimately people are not stupid. People can see, and people can realize what's going on here. How come you have 2,000 casualties, almost all of them civilians, and the other side about 70, almost all of them soldiers? People begin to see a little change. I don't think that it has ever become normalized into a narrative that people accept, but if we haven't reached the tipping point yet, we're very close to it. And I think that there is a real change in this country.
note of hope. Thank you for coming. It's been wonderful. Thank you for coming and speaking.